What got you into writing? I mean, here you from Warren High School. Give me your trajectory.
Well, I didn't do a lot of writing as a kid. It's one of my great regrets. I wish I would have been a member of the yearbook staff or written for the student newspaper. I did, given the era, write for an underground student newspaper called The Probe, an independent student newspaper.
Georgetown.
No, here at Warren High, yeah. Quite subversive, and was just amazing. I still have a couple of issues of that. But it was founded by Chris LaRoe, who was a class of '73 classmate of Jeff Bezos, who is still around town and still doing quite a bit of writing, has his own blog and does a lot of Facebook posting. But I did some writing for that independent newspaper, and then at Georgetown, I clearly remember this. My sophomore year, a history professor sort of tapping me on the shoulder after I had handed her a paper, and she said, "You know, you're really a good writer, and you should do it more." And so I tried to do a little bit of writing as an undergrad, but not nearly as much as I should have. But it wasn't until sort of after college when I realized I had this passion for history that I really wanted to explore. And I would start with small stuff, Greg, newspaper article for the Warren Times Observer here, and then something for Stepping Stones, which is the local historical society publication there, that sort of a thing. And it eventually sort of began building, and as I got deeper into middle age, it occurred to me that if I didn't get serious about writing books, then it was never going to happen.
Mr. Speaker, why select him?
Well, I wanted to do baseball first because that came most naturally to me. And I have believed since I was a kid doing, research on the great, Cooperstown figures, that Tris Speaker was probably the least appreciated great player in baseball history, and in many ways was probably up there with Willie Mays and the great Oscar Charleston, Negro League center fielder, is probably the best all-around baseball player of all time. And the deeper I got into researching Speaker, the more I realized he was a fascinating figure. He embodied in many ways the best and the worst of baseball. The best because he was so brilliant on the field, the only player in that incredible 12-year scheme to beat out Ty Cobb for an American League batting championship. Wherever Speaker went, whether it was Boston or Cleveland, winning seemed to follow, played on a lot of pennant-winning teams. And then in 1919, he became player-manager of the Cleveland Indians and pioneered what today we recognize as the platoon system. So he was really ahead of his time and a very resourceful, brilliant manager. That's the good part. The bad part is that he was, at least professed to be, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, cheated the way they all cheated back then. They called it, they had a wonderful euphemism, they called it arranging games, not throwing games. But it went on very pervasively throughout that era. It's not just the 1919 Black Sox that were corrupt. The 1919 Chicago White Sox were just doing what came naturally. Everybody got into postseason play back then and tried to make some extra coin. Both of the teams in the 1918 World Series, the Chicago Cubs and the Boston Red Sox, that included the great Babe Ruth, they arranged games back and forth, and they would stretch it out. There were very few sweeps back then. They would stretch it out, whether it was a 7-game series, some years it was a 9-game series. They'd try to stretch it out and kind of seesaw back and forth so that they could cash in with gamblers. Yeah, I always say to people when I do talks, if you care about the law, the sausage, or the national pastime, don't see how any of them were made because it's not pretty. The great Hugh Fullerton, who was one of the really great baseball seers, fabulous columnist based in Chicago back then, he thought at least a half dozen or so of the early World Series were not on the level. The very first inning of the very first World Series game ever played, the Boston Americans and the Pittsburgh Pirates, there was some suspicious shenanigans going on with Cy Young. and a ball got through the wickets of the first baseman and then got misplayed out in right field. Meanwhile, the Pirates were just kind of running around the base paths, scoring as people at the Huntington Avenue grounds in Boston booed. And the reason the Red Sox, the Boston Americans, that'll never happen again, I apologize for that. The reason the Americans were upset, were doing it, the crowd was so upset, they were such heavy favorites, they wanted to even out the odds. So better to throw the first game and make a little extra coin with the gamblers than to play it out on the level. The next to last game of the 1912 World Series, which is how the speaker book begins, that clearly was not on the level. It was so bad that John McGraw, the opposing manager of the New York Giants, this is Red Sox Giants, he sort of watches what goes on early on in that game and tells his players, we'll just swing at the first pitch because the Red Sox pitchers aren't really trying very hard. That thing ended up being a big lopsided win. But the next day, Ben, when the odds had evened out, the Red Sox, ended up winning the series, and Speaker was one of the great heroes.
1912, by the way, the starting pitcher for the seventh game, or the last game of that series, the eighth game, because one was a tie, was a guy named Hugh Bedient.
Hugh Bedient.
Rookie from Faulkner, New York.
That is absolutely correct. It's amazing, Greg. There can't be three other people in this world who know them. And two of them are sitting right here. That's a little scary, isn't it?
Absolutely is. But it's big.
But let me just say the other pitcher was, we should be genuflecting here, the great Christy Mathews. You talk about pop culture heroes. He was one of the great ones, early part of the 20th century. Sort of a great hero. Graduate. He didn't graduate from Bucknell, but he was the class president at Bucknell and a great gentleman and a scholar, and a perfect contrast to his manager, John McGraw. But it was, Mathewson gave up the tying and then go-ahead runs very late in that game, in the deciding game of the 1912 World Series, and supposedly left the mound in tears.
Of course, Johnny McGraw, just while we're going crazy, graduated from St. Bonaventure.
And grew up in Olean, New York. Yep. And so the great Huey Jennings was also a St. Bonaventure grad. Iya, wasn't that his nickname? That's what he yelled? Yeah. The amazing number of people from this part of the world who played a big role in, what people call the dead ball era, the early days of baseball, just absolutely amazing. And we've left out probably the most gifted. That was Rube Waddell. And I just happened to drive this morning through Tyrone, and I always sort of nod toward Rube. He was born there, grew up in St. Mary's in Elk County. Rube Waddell was quite possibly the greatest left-handed pitcher of all time. Connie Mack said he was better than Lefty Grove, which is saying a lot. And supposedly the only one who had the combination of fastball and curveball to match the great Rube Waddell was Sandy Koufax. That was the level at which Rube Waddell pitched. He was also probably mentally impaired, retarded in some form, notorious for chasing after fire engines if they happened to drive by the ballpark when he was on the mound, or if kids were shooting marbles underneath the stands before the game would start. They'd find him sort of in those situations all the time. But 1905 is another amazing World Series. That was the Philadelphia Athletics of Rube Waddell and the New York Giants of Christy Mathewson and the great John McGraw, Iron Man Joe McGinnity, just a fabulous group of pitchers then. And on the eve of that series, Waddell supposedly got hurt in a wrestling match with a teammate, but a lot of people believe that was cover, that gamblers had gotten to Waddell, and only the gamblers knew that Waddell would not be pitching in the World Series, which made, of course, the Giants heavy favorites. They bet the Giants heavy, and the Giants ended up sweeping the Athletics, and Mathewson had three shutouts. John McGraw from Olean, New York, was also part of that very dicey early days of baseball. McGraw owned a casino in Havana, and this is when Cuba was a great wintertime playground. And when the weather would turn bad, all the gamblers in New York, Chicago would go to Cuba and hang out with John McGraw. McGraw is involved in a number of very suspicious moments early on in baseball history, including trying to fix the very first World Series in 1903, and there are other sort of head-scratching moments throughout John McGraw's career.
Are you working on this book, The Arrangement? Is that something that's on your radar?
I would love to, my plan is to do a trilogy on baseball, which means I need to do one more baseball book, a trilogy on World War II, which means I need to do another World War II book, and then a trilogy on the Civil War. And I haven't quite gotten to the Civil War, but hope to start a Civil War book here pretty soon. But yes, I would love to write about corruption. The problem is it's very hard to prove. All we have to go with are columns from the likes of Hugh Fullerton and Ring Lardner and Damon Runyon and all the rest. But understand, they all hung out with gamblers. Baseball was part of the saloon culture of gambling back then, and it was part and parcel of, horse racing, which has never been on the up and up. And I know that comes as a shock to no one. If I said to you college football back then was a little corrupt, you wouldn't be shocked. If I said to you, thoroughbred racing or sculling weren't on the up and up, or any of the popular sports back then, you'd say, yeah. But if you say, well, the national pastime back then had some serious issues, a lot of people are resistant to that. But there's no doubt that baseball was not on the level. And in fact, it went on. My own personal theory is that what finally eliminated it was the Depression, and people did so much less gambling than they did less discretionary income, and gamblers moved on to other things because baseball was just, barely kept its head above water in the early 1930s. But there were bad moments. Even after Landis took over, there were some very bad moments, some of which involved John McGraw in the 1920s. And I hate to bore you with this, but can I tell you one more story? Have you ever seen a picture of how the 1926 World Series ended? That's the Cardinals and the Yankees. Babe Ruth worked a walk. That is the very famous game. Remember when
Grover Cleveland Alexander
came in to pitch against
Missouri.
Again, there aren't 5 people in the world who know this, but you do. It's same game. Grover Cleveland Alexander was still on the mound, 9th inning. Ruth was up, 2 outs. Yankees trailing by 1 run at Yankee Stadium in the 7th and deciding game of the World Series. Ruth worked a walk. This is Babe Ruth, 1926 now. He's no longer the svelte youngster he was in the 19-teens for the Red Sox. He is the rotund Bambino. He decides it's a good idea down 1 run to attempt to steal. And he was thrown out by such a large margin that there's a famous photograph of Rogers Hornsby, which I'm sure you've seen, Greg, extending the tag on Babe Ruth standing up. And that, again, was October 1926. The buzz throughout the sporting world is that the Babe had sort of thrown that moment because it was in his financial interest for the Cardinals to win the series. That, again, was October of 26. It was the following month when word got leaked out about Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker being implicated in a 1919 betting scandal that they were both very guilty in, but both got off because they hired high-priced attorneys who threatened Landis with all manner of lawsuits if they weren't reinstated. So even in 1926, now this is 7 years after the Black Sox scandal and 6 years after the Major League owners had installed Landis as commissioner, there were still some very unsettling things going on in baseball.
Tonight you're going to talk about Robert Jackson. What did you learn in preparation for tonight?
Well, it's just an amazing, amazing person. And what I love about it most is that both Warren County and Chautauqua County, these great rivals, Warren and Jamestown, can both claim part of Jackson's legacy. Jackson was born here in Spring Creek, but then raised and schooled in Frewsburg and Jamestown. And the most remarkable thing is how well educated and how literate he was. And he had never gone to college as an undergrad. It was all self-taught. And I'm going to guess his family's financial situation was such that they could not afford to send him to college. And of course, in the 1900s, he was born in 92, so he would have been, 1900s and teens, people just didn't, there weren't scholarships available. And he, basically taught himself not only that incredible eclectic knowledge that he kept throughout his life, but taught himself the law. I think he mentored with a local Jamestown attorney, and then went to Albany Law School. He crammed, 2 years of study into 1 year, and passed the bar, and then became one of the most prominent attorneys, not only in this part of the world, Western New York State, but in the eastern part of the United States. In Albany, he had met a young legislator named Franklin Roosevelt, although I think Bob Jackson actually called him Frank.
Right.
There could not be more than a handful of people in this world who called Franklin Delano Roosevelt Frank, but Robert Jackson was one of them. And Roosevelt had always been impressed with him. And when he was elected president, he brought him down first to serve in the Treasury Department, and then later as Solicitor General, as Attorney General, and then as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person in history to have served in all three of those capacities. As Solicitor General, Deputy Attorney General, and Attorney General, he argued 28 cases before the United States Supreme Court and won 27 of them. He was not only a brilliant writer, but he was a brilliant speaker, and very few people have that combination of attributes, but Bob Jackson did. And he was just one of those people who inspired confidence. Tell you, one thing I did not know about him is that FDR had him on the short list of potential presidential successors if FDR chose not to seek a third term in 1940. FDR also wanted to make Bob Jackson Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but did not have the opportunity for sort of whole series of extenuating circumstances. But amazing guy, and he clearly was the correct choice of Harry Truman. This was just a few days, literally a couple of weeks after FDR passed away in April of 1945. The Allies were preparing for the great war crimes trial of the Nazi henchmen around Hitler. Hitler, in fact, when Bob Jackson accepted the position as chief American prosecutor at what became the Nuremberg trials, Adolf Hitler was still alive. So was Heinrich Himmler. So was Joseph Goebbels. They had not committed suicide yet. That was, I believe, April 21st. I think Hitler committed suicide on either the last day of April or the first day of May of 1945, and then Goebbels and Himmler soon thereafter. And Jackson not only had to prosecute the criminals, he had to plan the whole undertaking. It was Jackson who chose Nuremberg as the site for the trials. He chose it for a very good reason. Nuremberg had been a really central part of Nazi propaganda. It's where the great stadium was that those awful Sieg Heil rallies took place. It's where Triumph of the Will, which is one of the scariest pieces of films you'll ever see, people literally marching in lockstep to Der Fuhrer, all of this in connection with the 1936 Berlin Olympics, but it was all filmed in Nuremberg. Hitler so loved Nuremberg's role in kind of Teutonic culture that when he adopted all of the awful repressive stuff against the Jews, laws that forbade them any measure of human or financial rights, he called them the Nuremberg laws. And fortuitously for the Allies, one of the few buildings that had not been severely damaged by Allied bombing in Nuremberg was the Palace of Justice. And the courtroom was in decent enough shape that with some renovation, they could turn it into a courtroom to try the Nazis, which they did. But it all had to be done very quickly. This was, the summer of 1945 that he met with the other Allies at the London Conference, where they adopted the principles to guide the war crimes trial and the international laws that we still abide by today. The whole thing is just extraordinary. Anyhow, Jackson had to not only plan the prosecution, he had to worry about getting the courtroom ready. You're wearing headphones now. Everybody in that courtroom had to wear headphones because there were Russians and French, the French and Germans, of course. It had to be all translated simultaneously. An American company called IBM did the translation, and the whole, it's remarkable, the translation system, which must have been incredible technology in 1945, really wasn't installed until a couple of days before the trials began. So that was sort of the level of logistical detail that Robert Jackson had to concern himself about. And it's really one of the truly transcendent moments in post-war America.
Wow. Wow, that was very amazingly and you never used an throughout that whole process.
Well, since you guys called me a couple of months ago, I must say I have thoroughly enjoyed the research. There's a book that came out just a few years ago by the sadly now late Joseph Persico called Infamy on Trial, which is just a beautiful narrative history of Nuremberg. Earlier, one of Jackson's deputies, Telford Taylor, wrote a very good book called Anatomy of Nuremberg. There are a dozen other books, plus some incredible magazine articles that I was able to unearth, and I have really enjoyed this whole process.
Well, this may be your next writing assignment.
Well, I'd love to do it. I'm trying to figure out, Greg, if there is a dimension to Nuremberg that hasn't been covered. But it's the whole thing is incredible. It took so long. They started on November 20th, 1945. They didn't finish until October of 1946. Imagine trying to do anything with the Russians, the Brits, and the French. Imagine these wily, awful Nazis testifying. We had to grant the Nazis equal protection and due process and give them a chance to have all the rights that would be given to anyone in the Allied countries, save Russia, in any kind of criminal prosecution. So the whole thing is just remarkable. It took so long, but it finally resulted in the convictions that it needed to. 19 of the 21 defendants were convicted and 12 were hanged. And it's an incredible human drama on top of all of the legal and diplomatic and superpower issues that sort of surround the trial. Yeah, Walter Cronkite was an amazing guy. In the twilight of his life, he made two fabulous documentaries with a British filmmaker. Alistair Lascelles has become a great friend, and I had the honor of being in Alistair's documentary on the Kennedy assassination and Cronkite's great coverage of that at CBS, and then helped with a documentary that appeared on PBS and the BBC last summer on Johnson and civil rights that was also very nicely done. But Alistair worked with Cronkite on two great World War II documentaries, City at War about London, and then A Country at War about England and after the hostilities ended. But this was Cronkite in his 80s now. And the crew would be filming all day long, and they would go up to Molesworth, where he had covered the 8th Army Air Force bombing campaign against Nazi Germany, and they would visit the restaurants and the pubs that he had frequented in London with Homer Biggert and his other pals, with Andy Rooney and others in London during the war. And it would reach the end of the day, and they would have already filmed for 10 or 12 hours. They would be dog tired. And Cronkite would say, okay, what's the hot restaurant in town? You know, where can we go to have some fun? And just an inexhaustible supply of energy, and just an amazing guy to be around. And that's the way he was. His daughters told me he worked hard and he played hard, and he was a tough taskmaster at CBS. But as soon as the credits would roll and you'd see him light the pipe, he'd say, "Okay, guys, you know, cocktails are on me. Let's go." There was a little pub around the corner on West 57th Street in Midtown that they'd go to almost every night. Just an amazing guy. One other Walter Cronkite story. His daughter Nancy told me once, he used to keep these old junker cars, Martha's Vineyard, and he drove race cars. That was one of his hobbies. And he would take these old junkers on these country roads in Martha's Vineyard and drive them much too fast. And Nancy would say, "Daddy, you're going over the speed limit." And he would put on his big anchorman voice and say, "Posted speed limits are for people who don't know how to drive."
So what's next?
Well, I'm working on an Underground Railroad, hopefully a mini-series on the Underground Railroad. And this is something I wanted to do a book on the Underground Railroad 2 years ago, but figured out fairly early on in the research that the Underground Railroad may be a beautiful story in American history and an important one, but it's all myth and fable, and we really can't get it down to empirical fact. And as you noted a few minutes ago, I like to write about fact and not fictionalized history. Hollywood, however, operates by a different set of rules. So I did a screen treatment on this theme, shared it with a Hollywood producer guy that I've gotten to know because he wants to make a miniseries out of Assignment to Hell. So far, we haven't quite gotten there. But he liked it very much. He's been working with a professional screenwriter, and very soon we should have what could be a 10-part sort of mini-series scoped out. And we're hoping between PBS now, I don't know if you guys have seen Mercy, which is the thing that is now on after Downton Abbey on Sunday nights on PBS. They're now commissioning original, historically themed movies. You've got Netflix, of course, Showtime, and other potential platforms. So we all need to keep our fingers crossed and join hands in prayer that something good happens. A story about Eddie playing basketball. This was his senior year. My sophomore year, we're playing Cranberry, which is, way down halfway to Pittsburgh. And Cranberry was a tiny school, and their gymnasium, if you can picture this, doubled as an auditorium. So it was the stage was sort of on the same level as the gym floor. And they had a pair of doors that double doors that opened this way. And Eddie was a big kid, 6'3", 220 pounds, came down with a rebound and did this forearm shiver thing. And there was a kid, and here it is, 40-odd years later, I remember his name, Frank Clark. Frank Clark was draped all over Eddie, and Eddie gave him this little shiver, and he went careening across the gym floor, across the stage, hit the double doors. The doors opened up to a hallway at Cranberry High School. He sprawled into the hallway. The doors closed behind Frank. And the next thing, so Warren's now got the rebound. They're heading toward the other end of the floor. Everybody's watching. Frank's at this end. You hear and see the doors rattling. It was locked. It took, I'm going to say, a good 20 seconds for someone to come out of the stands, open up the door, and let Frank back into the game. And it was wonderful. It was like this sort of stage moment. He knew everybody was laughing at him, and he turned to the kid who opened up the doors and gave him a salute.
That's terrific.